Good evening, welcome to On the Record. I'm Adam Jasser. Poland and Eastern Europe are facing the old dilemma. Who will help if Russia keeps trying to conquer its neighbors? And is the era of firm US security guarantees, including nuclear deterrence, over? And what does Donald Trump's drive for quick peace in Ukraine tell us about America's attitude to Europe? Tonight we go on the record with Sir Robin Niblett, Distinguished Fellow at Chatham House, the leading British foreign policy think tank. Sir Robin had been its director for several years and is among the world's most respected analysts. Good evening, Robin. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for the invitation, Adam. Pleasure.
Last time we spoke was many years ago when the world was going through the great economic crisis. It was a scary moment, but what probably saved the day back then was that America and Europe closed ranks and provided a coordinated response. Fast forward to now, and what have we got?
Oh, right. If you're stopping there, what have we got? We've got a very uncertain relationship between the United States and Europe in how they manage what is certainly for Europe its biggest security challenge since the end of the Cold War. So it's a reminder to Europeans that the Cold War was a unique time. It was a unique time where US interests converged closely with those of Europe, when the European market was important for US presidents, both Republicans and Democrats, when the economic linkages were deep and reasonably balanced, but that in some ways America seems to be going back a bit to type, at least in Donald Trump. Back to a country that really resents being entangled globally, having to fix other people's security problems. And I think this really is a profound transition moment. Trump winning once, maybe is an aberration, but twice, looks like a pattern.
Right. So for Central Europe and Poland, this creates a huge headache. As much as officials insist that they trust US assurances, they must manage the risk. And they're fast rearming, but like West European partners, they realize that one component may be missing pretty soon, which is nuclear deterrence. And Poland has been talking about it quite bluntly. Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski warned the Republicans a year ago that they risked unleashing a new nuclear arms race, while President Duda made several appeals to Americans to move their nuclear warheads to Poland. Let's see how that went.
If the supplemental doesn't go through and US allies are disappointed and get the idea that the United States might not be able to help you even when the commander-in-chief wants to help you, that will have profound consequences for all of American alliances around the world. Some countries will start hedging, and others will be considering developing their own nuclear weapons programs.
The borders of NATO moved east in 1999, so 26 years later, there should also be a shift of the NATO infrastructure east. For me, this is obvious. I think it's not only that the time has come, but that it will be safer if those weapons were already here.
So I haven't talked to the president about that particular issue, but I would be shocked if he was supportive of nuclear weapons extending further east into Europe. We have got to be careful, Laura. We are playing literally with the lives of the future of human civilization.
Game over when it comes to nuclear sharing with Poland?
Well, I think game over for the time being, with the idea that the United States would move some of its land-based nuclear capability further east. If the war with Ukraine and the invasion that Russia has undertaken there is part to try and keep NATO away, then the idea that you would bring the forces closer to it. Remember, from a Soviet standpoint in the last Cold War, they had a buffer zone. It was called the Warsaw Pact. But if we get to a point where Russia and nuclear weapons owned by NATO are increasingly close together. I think, I hate to say this, J.D. Vance is probably right, that it would certainly be seen as an escalatory step by the Russians at a time when we really need to focus on ensuring the survival of Ukraine as a sustainably sovereign country.
Okay, so bad timing on the part of the Polish president probably, but Mr. Sikorski did not name Poland, but is he in principle right that middle powers, which have been over-reliant on US security guarantees, Poland, Japan, South Korea, should seek their own nuclear deterrent?
Well, the fact of the matter is that I think the risks of nuclear proliferation probably start, first of all, further away from Europe. And you noted there, South Korea, as you may know, public opinion polls have regularly shown over 65%, sometimes up to 70% of South Koreans supporting the idea that they should have a nuclear capability. So as the United States becomes more America first, and under President Trump, it is explicitly America first, those countries that have relied upon treaties that in the end depend upon the credibility of the view of the President of the United States and the group around him, the other people advising that president. If we look at those advising President Trump today and he himself, this is not a man that seems to believe in alliances at all, never mind protecting allies with nuclear weapons that could bring the United States into risk. So I'm afraid I wouldn't trust, I'll say this openly, I'm not a government official, I wouldn't trust the United States nuclear guarantee over NATO right now, today, under President Trump. But let me just say one more thing. Ukraine has defended itself against a nuclear-armed Russia now for, getting on for 3 years. And it has even done incursions into Russia. It has driven the Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol. And it has done all of this with limited conventional capability. So I believe two things. Number one, Europe needs to invest in its conventional capabilities and make it a credible deterrent of its own. We will then be a better ally to the United States and will be a better ally to any future administration that may come in. And then the last point I'd make is I think any Russian president has to worry that even a 5% possibility that a US president might use nuclear weapons will give him pause. So as long as Article 5 exists and the United States is a member of NATO, even though the credibility of that deterrent may be weak today, Article 5 is not a strong commitment to defend other countries. It is there to try to maintain stability in the North Atlantic area. In any case, I think we need to focus on our conventional capability.
Right. You stole my line, but I will stick to my scenario and say this, that, the disparity between what the Europeans have at the moment and what Russia has on the other hand is probably something Europeans should be concerned about. Let's take a look at the map. So, again, to what extent this is a central issue? Because if it's not, perhaps you're right that, conventional arms are a priority, but maybe there is space for some joint program under the French and British leadership in which Poland, for example, could take part. Incidentally, Poland said on Thursday it was going to enter a mutual defense treaty with France, so this perhaps could be part of it.
Look, when I look at the steps that the UK took under the Lancaster House Agreement signed back in 2010 between Britain and France, we agreed to do closer nuclear sharing, but it was principally on testing nuclear capabilities in virtual tests, not doing them obviously anymore as live tests. It was very much a functional, tactical form of cooperation. That's the first point. Second, Britain relies on the United States for the credibility of its nuclear missiles. We have our own warheads. We're buying submarines, building submarines, but our Trident missiles are brought from the United States. They have to be serviced by them. And so there is already a sort of connectivity there that makes the ability of the UK to sort of shift its nuclear capability and somehow apply it separately to its engagement with the US quite complicated. However, unlike France, Britain has put its nuclear deterrent at the service of NATO. Yeah, the French are not part of the integrated nuclear chain of command in NATO, whereas the UK is. And so I would have thought some type of continuing closer relationships, planning, etc., under the NATO umbrella including with UK and, if it would be possible, in a future French president, with French capabilities inside the NATO integrated nuclear chain of command, that would be an important step forward. Honestly, I've heard what President Macron said, but I cannot believe that you in Poland or any other EU member or European member of NATO could trust that a French president would sacrifice the survival of France in return in a nuclear exchange with Russia. And maybe the same for the future British Prime Minister. I'm not being selective there. I think there is something about the nuclear umbrella that was built under NATO that had an infrastructure around it that made it credible. And I think we need to keep that credibility as strong as possible, even though right now, undoubtedly, it's the weakest point in my knowledge in the history of the alliance that guarantee has been.
But as we know, many European countries, before the non-proliferation treaty came into force in the late 60s and at the beginning of the 70s, had nuclear programs. Sweden had one, especially directed at the threat from the Soviet Russia. Even the Swiss had a nuclear program. So do you think that we will see a revival of some of these programs, or are they too expensive, too complicated? At the end of the day, Europeans need to focus on conventional arms, as you said before.
Well, it's not so much to do with the complexity. I believe, if Japan put its mind to it, it would probably be able to have a nuclear, even deployable nuclear weapon very quickly. Advanced states, Germany, most European states, not all, obviously, but certainly those that have civil nuclear programs and that have the capacity to build their own missiles. Obviously, nuclear submarines, you've got to work about which leg of the triad is credible and deterrable. But what's really held us back has been a belief that Europe is safer, obviously, with NATO and with the United States at the core of it. And I go back to the point I made earlier. Even a 10% risk that the United States might follow through with some type of action that was nuclear, if Russia, and we have to assume that is the foe we're talking about here, the rival we're talking about here, even a 5% chance, I think, would give the Kremlin pause for thought. China, as you know, spoke actively, and Xi Jinping, I think we understand pretty confidently, told Vladimir Putin in the early phases of this full-scale invasion.
This is a no-go area, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was it's an important reminder, because the Chinese know if anything like that happened, then Japan, South Korea, who knows, Taiwan, which also had a nuclear program back, several decades ago, but had its own nuclear program, would go ahead with them. So I am worried. I'm worried about nuclear proliferation. I'm more worried about it, frankly, at the moment in East Asia and the Middle East than I am in Europe.
In Europe, okay. So let's go back to the European. To the conventional arsenal, because it seems that for Europeans the priority should be really to focus on beefing up their conventional arsenal, have enough troops to secure a ceasefire when it comes in Ukraine, and the progress seems to be mostly verbal. And Central Europe seems to be reluctant to send troops. We just heard from General Kraszewski, because, well, at the end of the day, they're just loath to provide Putin with an excuse for an aggression against the Baltic states or even Poland. And even with Britain, we're not entirely clear where we stand. Or am I wrong there?
Well, I think there are two separate things. One is how credible is our European commitments to start to take more responsibility for their own security. Now, it's always helpful when you have a deus ex machina in an external driver, which President Trump, with his various comments about NATO not wanting to support certain ones, and his comments about Russia, and I want to be even-handed between Russia and Ukraine and so on. These are reminders that Europe is probably going to have to look after itself. The fact that he now sees any type of military support for Europe as a payment that needs to be repaid in some shape or form. This is a completely new world. And to be frank, I'm quite impressed actually by the way European governments are stepping up, at least on the spending front.
Right.
As you well know, on average, we're over 2% of GDP. You look at Poland, which is a good example. Right. Britain is getting up there. It's just cut its, you have a Labour government that's cut its aid budget from 0.5 to 0.3 of GDP, having pledged it was going to take it up to 0.7 after the Conservatives dropped it. That's not that's real money and a real cost. There are some laggards, Spain, Italy to a certain extent.
Yes, well, they're far away from Russia, so maybe their sense of urgency is different. But which reminds me, you had a comment on Britain's response to everything when you saw this extraordinary interview with Mr. Trump's chief negotiator, Mr. Witkoff, when he commented on Britain. So yes, let's take a look at that.
Watch it, yeah.
When Trump's Russia envoy Steve Witkoff is at best a naive Neville Chamberlain, we better hope that there are some Winston Churchills in Europe. Shocking comments by Witkoff to pro-Kremlin Tucker Carlson. Europe better be ready to go it alone. So what was that about?
Well, what that was about was the comments made by Witkoff saying, we don't need Churchills right now in Europe. The implication being that we need to do a deal. Now, I've been on the record, in fact, earlier last year, saying that I felt as Europeans and the Biden administration at its time should have a view of what we think a credible peace should be, and we should be working towards that peace. And I'm on the record of saying I reckon a sustainably sovereign Ukraine could survive and even thrive with 80% of its territory under its control. I'm not recommending it should give up its sovereignty or its claim on what has been stolen from it. But there is a capacity to survive. But to survive, Ukraine's European allies and its neighbors, we have the most skin in the game, the most interest in the survival of Ukraine. We need to step up. And stepping up means the meetings that have been going on today in Paris, and the meetings that were taking place in London recently, working out what kind of forces we might physically put on the ground in Ukraine to demonstrate to the Kremlin, to Vladimir Putin, that we have as much skin in the game in the survival of Ukraine as a sustainably sovereign state as Putin has in turning it into a Belarus or a vassal state or a province of Russia. Unless we demonstrate that commitment, we're not going to be there. Now, if European governments are willing to step up and demonstrate and take that risk, potentially put troops in harm's way, which is what Keir Starmer and Macron and others are talking about, I don't expect the US negotiator to turn around and say, why are you doing that? Trying to be little wannabe Churchills.
Yes.
I mean,
yes, we actually have collected.
I don't want you to muck up the negotiation,
right.
Or I want to do a deal that may end up being more favorable to Russia than it is to Ukraine. And then, we're back to Neville Chamberlain.
Well, we actually have collected some other pearls of wisdom from that interview of Mr. Witkoff.
Oh, good.
Regard Putin as a bad guy. That is a complicated situation, that war, and all the ingredients that led up to it.
I just don't see that he wants to take all of Europe. I feel that he wants peace. I take him at his word in this sense.
He takes him at his word. Any comment?
Well, yeah, he was being loyally. I take him at his word in this sense, and in this sense is what he said earlier in the sentence. I don't believe that Putin wants to take all of Europe, which is a typically hyperbolic straw man, if I could say. Because
half of Europe will do, right?
So what's the point of saying that? Because everyone knows he doesn't want to take all of Europe. What we know is he'd like to take all of Ukraine. What we fear is that he might want to reassert control one way or another over other former parts of the Soviet Union in his mind, which could include the Baltic states, Moldova, and who knows, and then basically have a buffer zone of vassal states, sort of, if not Warsaw Pact. So that's what he wants. The question is, who's going to stop that from happening? Now, personally, I'm afraid I don't think the Trump administration cares one way or the other.
Yes.
About this.
Yes, you have a point there, but even it seems to me that Mr. Witkoff's boss, Donald Trump, although he may be equally fond of Mr. Putin, but even he seems to have realized that perhaps Putin is playing America. He said this week, "I think that Russia wants to see an end to the war, but it could be that they're dragging their feet." The rest of the sentence wasn't very clear, but what is clear is that there is no 30-day ceasefire. So what is your assessment? Where do we stand with all of this now?
Well, where we stand with it is that, you know, and if you watch the whole of the Tucker Carlson interview with Witkoff, which sadly I did, you know, Tucker Carlson keeps saying what a brilliant negotiator Steve Witkoff is, and then the Trump administration. I remember Trump 1.0, you know, the North Korean negotiations lasted for a while, then President Trump lost interest, and we've ended up with a more dangerous situation in North Korea than when he was president beforehand. We've had the brilliant negotiation in the Middle East to stop the fighting and to end up with the release of some of the hostages, and now we've got war against Hamas again. So, you know, I'm afraid my fear is that where we are with the negotiations is right at the beginning of a grinding process, and I think everyone, if I may say so, is playing their role.
Right.
Ukraine is playing its role, trying to keep America on side, but continuing to defend itself as much as it can. The Europeans are playing their role, which is to say, we're going to help you, President Trump. We're going to actually make sure that Ukraine can survive, and you won't have to worry too much about it. We're going to provide a reassurance force. Yes, we'd like some intelligence, but you probably heard there's now discussions, and President Macron even made the comment that we may have to go there alone. Now, I know there may be other European countries that won't be willing to. And the Europeans are keeping up the sanctions. They passed a 17th sanction package just recently, which is the opposite of what you think the US would be doing. So I think everyone's playing their role.
Yeah.
And Trump's role, if I were to be sort of charitable, Trump's role is to make Putin think that he's winning something.
Right.
The charitable interpretation.
Yes.
Okay?
Well,
and
you know,
to give him things, you know, yeah.
So, you know, the bottom line is these negotiations may continue for quite a while. And interestingly, this is the point that the historian Neil Ferguson, who you know very well, made recently. He also remarked that underneath all the bluster from the Trump team and the normalization of Putin by Mr. Witkoff lies the realization that America's weakness, you know, that America is weak relative to the China-Russia axis, if you will. And so in his argument, Neil's argument, Trump is pursuing realpolitik on par with President Nixon when he struck the deal with China to counter the then main opponent, Russia. So now it's the reverse Nixon, trying to prize Russia away from China, which has become the main U.S. adversary. What's your take on this?
Well, I like a lot of what Niall Ferguson writes, and I agree with a lot of it, but I don't agree with that.
Okay, tell us why.
Well, first of all, I don't think President Trump is a Nixon, and Steve Witkoff is no Kissinger. So
that's for sure.
These are not real realists, if I can put it that way. And it's important to be aware that we're dealing with very different people at a very different time with very different objectives. And ultimately, I think the way that President Trump sees the situation is as follows. We've got this war going on in Ukraine that is giving Russia to China. Yeah, it's actually sort of handing it over. The Chinese are coming in, taking all the markets, getting the investment in rare earth minerals. They'll be taking all of the energy supplies. And the American companies are being squeezed out of one of the biggest markets for the things that Trump loves: commodities, rare earth minerals, physical, tangible stuff. And so he is determined to make sure that America gets a look in. So I think what he's trying to do is end the Ukraine war. Then Russia will be able to talk with us. We'll be able to talk with them. They won't need China as much. We'll be able to play a bit more. We can then send, American companies back into the Russian market and make money. This is about making money. This is not about making Realpolitik. So I think we have a very, very different context here between the two. I'm afraid if you look at, I don't know if you saw President Trump just released a few hours ago their revised version of the minerals deal. It's a heist. I mean, we're back to the terrible stuff that Scott Bessent tried to strong-arm Zelensky into about a month ago, ahead of the Munich Security Conference. So I'm afraid I think President Trump thinks in a very different way. He's not interested in Realpolitik. He's interested in carving up things.
Right. Well, we have to finish now. Thank you very much. Robin Niblett, Distinguished Fellow at Chatham House, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Adam. My pleasure.
Thank you very much for watching On the Record. Stay with us for more news and analysis.